Hi everyone and welcome to AXA Coral Live. It's fantastic to have all those classes from around the UK and the US joining us this morning for a live lesson all about the future of the coral reef. And this is an exam grade lesson, so we'll get into some of the details across the next 45 minutes. If you are watching, do remember to send in your questions as well. We love to have your questions, and those can be entered into the chat app beside the video. Now, we are broadcasting from the Carmarby Research Station on the island of Curacao in the Southern Caribbean. It's been our home from home for the past 10 days of Coral Live, and it's also a home from home for many scientists and reef experts and conservationists from around the world. Some using the facilities for just a few weeks, some staying here much longer, and some came here on a short visit and have ended up being here for over 10 years. The wonderful thing about having a research station such as Carmarby is that it's next to the wonderful reef environment behind me and surrounding the island of Curacao, but it also has research facilities such as laboratory space, wet labs and microscopes, all those things that scientists and researchers need to understand this amazing underwater environment better. In today's live lesson about the future of the reef, we're going to cover just a few things. We're going to be looking at the predictions for how the reef might survive into the future, but we'll also be looking at what can be done to mitigate the stresses that it's experiencing. And it's my great delight to welcome Matthew to this lesson. Matthew, thank you so much for being part of Coral Live again. Fantastic to have you. You very kindly shared what a day in the life of a scientist was like, and today you've sort of joined us with one of your hats, which has been working for a reef restoration organization. I've got that right?
Yes, I've been working with coral restoration for 3 seasons of coral spawning now, so it's good to be back and share the message a little.
Fantastic. And I think the organization is Core. You've been looking at restoration and reproduction. And there's an amazing video that the organization has made that shows us what that work looks like in action. So great, I think we're going to see that promo, and then we'll be able to discuss the wider issues around marine conservation. It's really important to think, when we think about reef restoration, it's not just an easy process, but one that requires dedication, and we'll see some of your colleagues, I think, in just a moment.
Coral reefs are distributed around the tropical belt of the ocean. They are hotspots of biodiversity and home to many creatures. Today, there are fewer and fewer healthy reefs that are bursting with life. It's getting harder for corals to grow and reproduce on their own. And the tiny coral babies have a hard time surviving. In fact, our world is changing rapidly. Corals are dying and reefs are declining worldwide. How can we address this magnitude of loss? This now adult coral was outplanted into the wild a few years ago. Most corals get in the mood for love during one special event per year. Under the cover of night, corals of each species synchronize their spawning at a secretly appointed time. The coral's own reproductive potential could allow work on larger restoration scales. One may be able to grow millions of coral babies, each genetically unique, from one spawning event. Genetic diversity is the key to giving corals the best chance to adapt to a changing world and to survive. Vast quantities of the coral's spawn, the coral's eggs and sperm cells, may fill the ocean with a spawning snowstorm. Some of that spawn can be collected with special nets and used to grow new coral babies to support natural propagation. After the coral spawn is fertilized in the lab, the little embryos start to grow into coral larvae. A few days later, these swimming coral larvae attach to the bottom and change into baby coral polyps. For a coral larva, a suitable place to settle can be a special surface like a tile that can be handled easily. Then the coral babies need a safe kindergarten where they can be raised in huge numbers. The last step is to bring the coral babies into the wild. Special tiles settled on by tiny corals are able to be directly seeded onto the reef. Now the young corals have to grow. One day, if all goes well, they will eventually grow into adult coral colonies and spawn again.
Matthew, I mean, extraordinary work being done there by Seacor. Fantastic video giving us that overview of coral restoration. We're going to take a sort of step back a bit and look at the wider context of the future of the reef. And I think we've got this slide up that shows projected levels of health for sort of birds, for mammals, for amphibians. And we've got this rather drastic line for coral? What's going on there? Why so dire?
That's really not the line that we want to be looking at when we're thinking about corals. Corals are facing a lot of threats globally at the moment. There are changes that are happening in their environments that are making it very hard for them to continue living and continue growing. We've all heard about climate change, global warming. There are a lot of things out there that are threatening these reefs. And we have started noticing as a scientific community over the last years that we've been studying corals that they are disappearing in certain places at certain times. And a lot of research has gone into trying to understand what's really happening with them and what this all means. And some of the experiments that have been done are showing that if we think ahead to how the climate is changing and the oceans that the corals find them in is changing, what those conditions will be like for them and how well they're going to do. A lot of the work that's been done is showing that corals are really at a very high risk of disappearing in a lot of places. So you see this huge 70 to 90% predicted decline in coral reefs because the threats are so large and they're really living at their, like the edge of their ability to survive right now.
We see this very drastic straight line decline, and yet when we look at a graph of coral cover from somewhere like the Central Great Barrier Reef, perhaps one of the best known coral reefs in the world, we see it sort of more of a sort of a wavy, cover. It's not just a sort of straight line. But I think we can see some dips. There's a big dip in 2011 with Hurricane Yasi. How do these tropical storms, how do these storms affect reef health? Why is that such a big dip?
Well, tropical storms you really have to imagine there's a huge amount of energy when a storm blows through. And one of the things that we're lucky to have coral reefs for is they protect the shoreline from a lot of the energy that these storms generate. But they are only as strong as they are. And if the storm is really powerful, like the cyclone Yasi was in 2011, that can be too strong and it'll physically break the coral reef apart and destroy a lot of the actual coral skeletons, which obviously then leads to them dying. So you'll see a dip when you have these really big storms that come along because so many coral have died. But then you also do see that if enough of them have remained healthy, that the dip can come back and you do get some coral cover coming back and some new growth, as long as there is still some healthy coral.
Some healthy coral out there to start to sort of reseed, as it were.
Yeah.
And then we've got this other dip in 2016, 2017, when I think it was a mass bleaching event. I know we're going to cover bleaching in just a bit. But what was very interesting to hear you say is that there is recovery, there is growth. It's not a set downward path.
No, I think when you see that first graph of the very scary straight red line going down, you think that there's only one direction that it's going to go. With things like tropical storms, these are kind of periodic disturbances. So the storm blows through and then it passes over. So if there is still healthy coral, it has a chance to recover. In 2016 and 2017, there were these mass global bleaching events because the sea temperatures got very high for a very long time. And again, that was a periodic disturbance, so we hope to see some more recovery now. But if these disturbances keep happening, then there's less chance for the healthy coral to recover.
Wow. So I think we're just going to recap some of these stresses, because if we want to look at solutions to what we need to do to have healthy corals, it's just important to remember what is impacting them. And really we've got sort of three sort of sets of stresses or disturbances. We've got one sort of these global threats, and we've touched on heating, ocean heating, we've touched on acidification in previous lessons, so we'll talk a little bit about that. We've then got local pieces here, whether it be land use or overfishing, and then there's the sort of storm issues as well. We're going to sort of focus to start off with on these global stresses and what needs to be done. Just for our audience here, can you just recap how, first of all, ocean heating and then changes in ocean pH affect the health of the coral reef?
Sure, Jamie. So to touch on coral in global warming, firstly, and heat and how that affects corals, corals live in an environment where they are very close to the threshold of the temperature that they can sustain. So small changes in that temperature can actually become very stressful to them. It feels like a much bigger change. And corals, you may have learned in previous lessons, it's an animal, but within the animal tissue, there are also plants. And these plants provide a huge amount of the energy for corals which they need to survive. Now, the plants are quite sensitive to light and quite sensitive to temperature. And if there's too much light and too much temperature, then the plants themselves can become a form of a toxin within the coral tissue. And the plants will actually leave the coral tissue, which is when we see coral bleaching. So instead of this beautiful coral skeleton, you end up being able to see the white that's beneath the tissue because all of the plants that were in the tissue have now been expelled.
And the plants are important because they provide so much energy for the coral animal itself.
Yes, so they use photosynthesis to convert the light energy in the environment into sugars that provide up to 90% of the coral's food. So if they lose that for long enough, they're losing 90% of their food, and there's a chance that they can starve and the corals may not do very well. Which leaves us just with this white calcium carbonate skeleton that you can see when there's coral bleaching.
And so we call it bleaching because the coloration goes, and just like bleach on clothes, it causes it to go white.
Exactly.
The other thing that's happening with increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere is that's being absorbed into the ocean and changing its pH, making it more acidic.
Yes.
Why does that matter for coral health?
So that matters a lot for coral health because the way that a coral makes its skeleton is out of calcium carbonate, which is quite similar to what your bones are made of, what a lot of other sea animals also make their skeletons out of. And calcium carbonate, if it's placed in an acidic environment, will dissolve. Now, if you are in an environment where you are trying to grow and make more of your own skeleton, but the environment is becoming more and more difficult for that to be possible, then you as an organism are going to struggle, and you might even see your skeleton dissolving and being very hard to grow.
And so thank you so much, Matthew, for that overview, that sort of recap on the impact of high CO2 on coral health. When we're looking therefore at what we can do to preserve the future of the reef, we're looking at sort of a global response here, whether that's on an international level, a national level. So we've got things like, I think COP26 is in the right direction, if not necessarily the right speed. If that, if,
That's a good way to put it.
is one way of looking at it. But we've also got things that people can do on a community or personal basis. I think looking at three broad categories of how we travel, how we eat, and how we live. What are some things that we're looking for people to do in terms of changing travel? What might people at home or people in the UK and US sort of consider?
So when you're thinking about changing your travel in a way that's going to be useful for coral reef conservation or biodiversity conservation generally, you want to be thinking about ways to reduce, we spoke a lot about carbon, so reducing your carbon emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions. And different modes of transport can produce heavier amounts of carbon and other gases which are creating a greenhouse effect. So if you have an option to take something that generates less emissions and is better for the environment, so taking a bicycle instead of taking a car, sharing transports, getting on public transport like trains and buses, those things are going to be producing less emissions and are going to be having less of an effect, negative effect on the environment.
And then in terms of our diet, that seems to be a sort of sometimes overlooked, but a really important part of helping to decrease our sort of personal carbon budget, as it were.
For sure. Diet is a very important one that maybe doesn't get enough attention because we all like to eat the things that we like to eat. But what we eat, again, just like transport, some things generate more greenhouse gas emissions or just generally produce more pollution into the environment. So you can make some smart choices, again, about what you eat, looking for things that produce less emissions. But also, if you could eat more locally, then there's also the transport aspect that comes into what you eat, so you can reduce how much things have to be transported. So eating locally, eating in season, eating food types that are generating less emissions, using less land, can be very important for how climate change goes over the next
And
decades.
when we talk about eating food types that have an overall lower carbon budget, we're talking about more about plant-based diet.
Plant-based diets produce a lot less emissions and a lot less pollution in the environment for sure.
Brilliant, thank you. And the last one is a little bit messy, but it's sort of our relationship to stuff. You know, how does thinking about stuff help the coral reef?
Thinking about stuff, it's easy to think that when you pick up your t-shirt, that's all there is just that t-shirt. But if you look further up the line how that t-shirt was made, there's thousands of liters of water that are used to produce one t-shirt. Factories that are burning and producing emissions to produce one t-shirt. So all of the stuff that we accumulate, if it's not necessary for our survival, is an excess and an excess of emissions, and anything that we can do to make decisions about really sticking to what we need can reduce our impact on the environment.
Thank you, Bertie. Thank you so much for that exploration of looking at these global contexts of affecting reef health and some of the things that we can do to mitigate those. If we take a sort of a more local journey, if we look at a patch of, I think, reef just round the corner here, Curacao is blessed with some very healthy reef areas, but also areas which we can sort of say are basically not healthy.
Need some attention.
Need some attention. Looking at this video, we can see a sort of like a slimy brown sludge covering sort of some of the sort of broken structure. What's going on in this video?
A lot of what you're seeing in this video is turf algae that's growing over the hard substrate, places that would normally be good substrate for a coral to grow on. But because of a lot of the way that this reef, particularly here, has been treated through pollution and bad water quality, instead of there being healthy coral growing there, what we're seeing is one of coral's biggest competitors, which is turf algae and macroalgae, which are plants that like a very different environment to corals. They like high nutrients, they kind of like if there's a lot of sewage in the water. And this helps the competition that's always going on between the corals and the algae to tip in favor of the algae, where it's much more favorable for them to grow, so it's easier for them to outcompete the corals. And you end up with a reef like this, which really doesn't look very healthy at all.
And that's driven by human activity a lot, by sort of sewage or fertilizers from farming influencing the water quality. Is that's what's going on?
When you're looking at a reef like this, where a lot of the rubble that you're seeing there is former coral skeletons, you're looking at a reef at a point on the island where this used to be a good site for corals to grow. That's why you have all of these coral skeletons there. But changes have happened very locally around this reef that have now killed the coral. Things like direct input from groundwater, from land use just around the coast, from development along the coastline, that have now made this an environment that's more suitable to algae.
And so in terms of mitigation, we're talking about things like water quality on a municipal or national basis, sewage treatment plants, regulations on fertilizer use. It's sort of more of that sort of national, municipal sort of mitigation and policy.
It's definitely a place where local governments can take action and can step in to put in place policies that will reduce the stress on the coral reefs by keeping the water clean.
But there is a natural friend that can help out and also probably helps out on a healthy reef as well. And I think we'll be able to see a video of our natural friend this coming up. Naturally, how does the sort of whole ecosystem help this balance between coral and algae?
We definitely have to remember that we are talking about an ecosystem. It's
Yep.
not just coral and algae out there. There are many different organisms that live on the reef, and many of them, like different types of parrotfish, sea urchins, are what we would call herbivorous grazers. So they have always been on the reef as long as the reef has been developing, and they serve a role to take away a lot of the algae by grazing on it because they eat it as a source of food. And this helps to keep the balance at a place where there is still food for the herbivores, where algae grows in between the corals, but the algae doesn't get too out of hand and overtake all of the coral on the reef.
So we want more herbivores, we want more of these grazers, and what are some of the actions that we can take to ensure that we have these grazers on our reef helping to maintain this balance between coral and algae?
I think there's two main ways to think about how we keep things like herbivores and just generally the better ecosystem balance on reefs. And one of them is by conserving what's already supposed to be there. So if these fish and these urchins that live on the reef are there naturally and are already providing this surface, one thing we could really try to do is to stop taking them away. So fishing for species that are herbivores that should be protected is something that we could change as a practice. The other thing is in places where overfishing has already been a problem and all of these herbivores have disappeared, there are restoration programs that can help to try to bring them back and restore that service on a reef.
So, I mean, for instance, in Curacao, we have a marine park here. We've got sort of what are called no-take zones within marine protected areas. That's a policy that seems to be a good thing to maintain fish stocks for a healthy reef.
One of the great things about these marine parks and these no-take zones is that they directly protect the area that is designated within the zone, where people are not allowed to go fishing, where there's a no-take zone or things like that. But it also serves as a kind of refuge, where then the fish and the other herbivores that are living within that zone can reproduce and recover from the stresses around them and help to repopulate the surrounding areas. You see in a lot of cases where there is a marine protected area or a no-take zone, that the areas outside of that start to bring back the populations as well, even though they're not being directly protected.
And I know we have Joel, who's one of the marine park rangers, who's going to join us just at the end of this talk and give a little bit more of a direct case study about how marine protection actually takes place. We've talked a lot about stopping bad things, and you touched at the end there on doing good things. You know, much like a forest is a forest fire, we can also help nature by replanting trees. Restoration, we saw that video at the beginning, but I'm just going to ask you, I think we can show a diagram of Seacor's work on screen, and just to take us through those steps. So for the first thing, I don't know whether you just want to briefly mention sort of how corals reproduce, because that's kind of key to the whole process.
That's really where this whole program with Seacor kind of comes in. So corals are animals, as we already know, and they can reproduce by making more baby corals. And one of the ways a lot of species will do that is what we call broadcast spawning, where they will release sperm and eggs into the water column, where they can mix from one colony of coral with another colony of coral from the same species to create a new coral baby, where you have crossing over of genes and more diversity in the corals that are then going to reattach themselves to the reef. And that diversity is very important for the long-term health of any coral reef ecosystem. So what Seacor does is takes this natural phenomenon, which is happening every year. We've been very lucky to go out and work with it, and we try to come in between in a way where we can boost the success of this process that's happening naturally anyway, by helping the sperm and eggs come together to make more babies with higher diversity and then put them back on the reef.
And to just go, I think we've got 5 steps to sort of describe. The first one is about tiles. What's going on there?
So if you're going to try to do some good, you really want to make sure that you set off with a really good plan. You could think the first step is going to be just going out and finding a coral, but if you don't have a way to actually work with what you find, then you're not going to be able to do much good. So if we know that we're going to be taking the sperm and eggs from the corals back to the lab to make some coral babies, with the end goal of taking them back on the reef, we need to make sure we have a little home for them to settle on. So Seacor has put a lot of work into studying what types of designs would be very good for creating a microhabitat that the coral babies will like to attach to, and have some protection in the very early fragile stages of their lives that can also then be handled in a practical way.
And then you sort of you touched on, when introducing this, speeding up or helping this natural phenomenon of broadcast spawning and then new coral colonies starting off. Last lesson you brought on this net. The sort of step after designing this is to go and collect the eggs and the sperm from the reef.
Yeah. So once we have our tiles and the nets and all of the other materials that we need to work with, then the next part of the challenge is finding corals of the right species, of the right maturity, that are going to produce, and collecting the sperm and eggs that we can then take back to the lab and do our best to get a much higher fertilization rate, so we have more babies than might occur naturally.
And then once they're in the lab, once the fertilization has happened, is that straight back out onto the reef, or is there a sort of kindergarten stage in between?
You can think of them just like babies. A human baby is very fragile in its early stages of its life and needs a lot of care. It needs its parents. So we try to do our best to be the parents of these new babies that we've helped come into the world through the early stages of their lives. So they start off as little coral larvae. Once the eggs have been fertilized, that will swim around, hopefully attached to these nice tiles we've made for them. And then they become what we would call a primary polyp or a coral settler, where they are still very small and will only just be starting to make a skeleton. So we will keep them in what you call the kindergarten or a nursery. We have one that we will put out in the ocean that we call a crib. And we will keep them there until we think that they are strong enough and old enough to survive being placed back on the reef.
Because that's the next stage, is placing these coral babies or toddlers back on the reef. What kind of age are we talking about there? It might differ between different species.
So really, if you're talking about restoration, the goal is always going to be to get it back on the reef. If you just keep it in the lab, then you're just doing research. So the goal really is to get them out there. And when you're doing this kind of work, there's always a balance between what is the best time for the coral and what is actually manageable as a team of humans that are working very hard to do this. So we're trying to find a balance point, usually within a week or 2 weeks, depending on the species, where we can get them back as soon as possible. We also don't want to protect them too much from the natural environments so they never get used to actually coping with the conditions that they will find on the reef. So the first 2 weeks are very important for them to settle, start growing their skeleton, start getting to a point where they have tentacles and they can catch food and feed themselves, maybe get their symbionts, and then we'll want to put them back on the reef really as soon as we can.
Symbionts being the algae, the zooxanthellae.
The plants that we spoke about earlier.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And symbionts is that science term for a living thing involved in symbiosis.
Symbiosis being living together. So the plants and the animal living together, depending on each other.
Perfect. And the last stage is really the sort of like monitoring what's going on and evaluating how it works, and probably then feeding back into the whole process again.
We are definitely still learning a lot about how we can do restoration better. And if you just take the corals, stick them on a tile and throw them in the water, you never know if you've really done any good. So it's very important to go back and check if your methods are actually working and if you need to change anything to get better results and actually have more corals growing back on the reef that you've put out there.
And over the past you've done this for 3 seasons, Matthew. What can you share anything that you've noticed or found?
It's one of the most heartwarming things when you put your corals out there and you try not to disturb them for a long time, and you look at them after a year and you see how big they've grown and that they're still surviving. Even this terrible reef that we looked at around the corner, we have hundreds of babies that were put out there 2 years ago that are still trying their best to try and bring some life back to the reef out there.
It's amazing, and it's so, I mean, you feel it's heartwarming. I feel like my heart warmed just by listening to the work that you've been doing. Does this mean that everything's going to be okay? We can rely on the Matthews, Kellys and Valerie's of this world and Seacor just to restore our reefs, and we don't have to take any action that we've spoken about before?
Unfortunately not, Jamie. We would love it to be that way, but restoration, specifically with the context that we're in, where the environment around coral reefs is changing and predicted to get worse, as we saw in the earlier slide. We spoke earlier about there being storms that come through and that being a periodic change that will then allow them to recover. But if what we are seeing is a trend where the disturbances and the stresses on the reefs are just going to accumulate and get worse and worse and more frequent, then restoration isn't really going to do enough. You can kind of think of it like if you were trying to build a sand castle on a beach, and you start building your sand castle as soon as the wave washes away, and you build your sand castle as quickly as you can because you want to have a castle there, but it's still, the tide is coming in and the wave just washes your castle away again. With restoration, what we really need is to get to a point where the tide stops rising, all of these changes stop increasing, and we can find a new normal where we can then build our sand castle and know that it's still going to be there.
So, I mean, it's almost a pact that we can make with our classes and students watching. Matthew's doing amazing work here. What kind of things would you like to see happening in classes and homes in the UK, USA and beyond?
I think it's really important not to think that the only way to help is to be physically putting a coral back on a reef. everything that you can do in your daily life, if you are making decisions to be part of the solution instead of choosing to be part of the problem, by changing the way that you eat, by taking your bicycle instead of catching a car, any decisions you can make to have less of an impact on the environment, and educating yourself is very important. Following classes like this, teaching other people, all of those things are taking good steps towards a better environment.
Matthew, thanks you so much. We've got a couple of questions, and then Joel is going to join us to give a case study to introduce you to the work being done on marine protection in Curacao. But just to take a couple of questions from students. The question is, where in the world is coral restoration being done? Obviously in Curacao, but are there projects all over the world where this is happening?
Yes, it's one of the amazing things about the community is people who work in coral restoration are very passionate about this. We all know we're learning, so we're sharing as much as we can. There are networks throughout the Caribbean. SECOR, the organization that you've seen in the video, is working in multiple destinations within the Caribbean, but also in Australia, also in places further out in the Pacific, in the Seychelles. There are a lot of restoration programs happening globally, a lot of them in the US as well. So it's really a global effort that's going on with restoration.
And it's a difficult question, but the question is how successful is coral restoration? I mean, can you put a sort of a grade? Can you give yourself an A or a B or a C sort of like grade out of how successful it is?
I wouldn't want to give a single grade to restoration that's part of this global effort, because there are different ways to do restoration and different areas have different stresses and are seeing different amounts of success. A lot of the work that we do here, we're seeing success for now, but this is an island where we're not experiencing too much variation, so we can see some success for now. That doesn't mean it's going to last forever. I would give everybody that's trying to do restoration an A grade, because I know we're all working hard to do our best.
Thank you. And that means we need an A grade from everybody on the different actions that we've discussed. Really interesting question here is, are some species easier to restore than others?
Yes, I think there are definitely species that we know more about, and certain species that are more accessible to us. We still need to go underwater into this environment, which can sometimes be a very high energy environment. There's lots of waves and currents. And some species that we've studied for longer, and because we can reach them, we know more about, so they're easier to work with in that sense. And there are different coral species, like these little brain corals like this. They grow very, very slowly, a few millimeters, maybe a centimeter per year.
Okay.
But there are other species, like what we would call the elkhorn, that's not one of them,
Well,
but they make these branching
coral.
structures
Yeah.
like this, which can grow a lot faster.
Okay.
So you see a lot of restoration programs working with them because it's easier to see the growth and get some larger coral cover quite quickly.
And just one tick, we'll have Joel, but a question is, how do you, we looked at sowing as a stage, how do you choose where to put a coral out on the reef?
So part of the learning process in restoration is you need to choose a lot of different environments and see what survives best. Now you could quite easily look at a reef and find a place that has got no of the fleshy algae growing on it, hard substrate, lots of other coral around it that you'll think this is quite obviously a place that coral want to grow, and you could put your coral seeds there and think they will have a very good chance of surviving. But if we're talking about restoration, we're talking about bringing back reefs that no longer look like that.
Yeah.
So we need to be putting them out in places like the reef around the corner and
Okay.
seeing if there are ways that we can modify that, maybe locally by introducing grazers or things like that, to help that environment become one that's favorable for the coral babies.
Brilliant. It's my great pleasure to welcome Joel Dominguez to Coral Live. Have a seat, Joel. Joel is a marine park ranger here in Curacao. Joel, thank you so much for joining this lesson. It's fantastic. One of the joys of being out here at Kamabi is that you never know which relevant, amazing person is going to be walking past. Thank you so much for just stepping in.
Thanks for having me.
Just briefly, we talked about the importance of no-take zones, marine protected areas to sustain and boost coral health. what are some of the things that you're doing here in Curacao to be part of the solution for coral?
Well, hopefully it's an uphill battle, and what we're trying to do is, starting with the easiest steps, is putting in buoys. We are planning on putting in 20 buoys to help the fishermen still be able to fish. And instead of actually dropping anchors and ruining our corals, we would really like to be able to moor right there in the buoys. That's one of the many steps, obviously, that we have, one of the main ones. And yeah, as you know, the gorgonians are there. We have sponges, we have hard corals. Every time they break the corals, you know, it's going to take a long time for them to come back. And East Point is one of the most important parts for us to be able to get the rest of the island to also become really healthy.
And so, I mean, it's one of the issues that we didn't really touch on when we're looking at helping corals is that there's been a lot of direct impact just by fishermen, as you were saying, dropping their anchor, you know, wherever, whether that's a soft coral, a sponge, bit of hard coral, and then ripping it off. In terms of the fishing community here in Curacao, you've been talking about working with them,
Of course.
and you know, and saying, you know, if you want more fish, almost don't fish.
Yeah.
That which sounds
Which is
odd.
a very hard mentality to really break, and also very hard to understand, because yeah, obviously everybody wants to fish. They want to feed their families as well. But to be able to have more fish, you need to be able to conserve a certain part of the island, I believe. And by that, we will be able to have more fish for the future, so their families and their kids will be able to have more fish as well, and more turtles, and have a healthier ecosystem.
I mean, it's fantastic that, you know, there is this global sort of movement. I think it's 30 by 30, where sort of each country is working towards protecting sort of at least 30% of its territorial waters by 2030. Curacao well on its way.
Well on its way. We're right around 30 as we speak now.
30. That's amazing. 30%.
Hoping that we can actually be building up to that. That is the East Point level, actually. So from there, we're hoping that maybe when we speak to you again, we could give you some higher numbers.
Absolutely fantastic. We've got time for just a few more questions. One of them very much directed at Matthew, which is, could you take coral from the Pacific and plant it in the Atlantic?
In theory, that would be possible. But when you were talking about coral reef restoration and conservation, conservation means keeping what you have. So if you are taking species from the Pacific and bringing them to the Atlantic, you're changing what is in the Atlantic. And because this is a coral from a very different environment, maybe it wouldn't survive here. You could try to pick species that you know like very similar conditions and pick your places really well. But if they do survive there, they could actually end up outcompeting all of the species that already belong here. So it might be theoretically possible if we need to one day in the future to have some coral, but it's not something that we would like to do.
And maybe, I mean, one of the pieces I've heard is that Red Sea corals are doing particularly well, but that's not an excuse to bring a whole bunch of Red Sea corals down to the Caribbean.
Not at all. The Red Sea is a particular environment, and yes, those corals are facing different temperatures, much higher temperatures than we see here in the Caribbean or you'll see on the Great Barrier Reef. But other things in that environment are quite different as well, the amount of nutrients, and those corals there have adapted very well to living locally in that environment. Maybe they could be taken to other places. Those species exist in the Pacific as well. There are people who are studying that, but bringing them to the Atlantic might not be the best idea.
Brilliant. Matthew, thank you very much. The last question is for Joel. And Joel, it's looking at stakeholders, and stakeholders is something that, you know, you have to study in geography, how different stakeholder groups respond to different moves. Would you say that mostly people are happy or unhappy about marine protection, including being worried for their livelihoods?
I think all in all, people are very happy. They're looking at actually the future. So everybody's very happy with it. Obviously, you do have to change a little bit of mentalities, which is the people that they might not be looking at the bigger picture about having more fish and having more things to actually be able to have for their children, you know. And as I said, the easiest thing is more fish is going to be always a good thing for the rest of the island, healthier coral reef, and good sustainability for ourselves and also the water.
Brilliant. So, I mean, one of those tough things as a species that humans have is thinking into the future, doing things for our long-term benefit rather than having a short-term view. Matthew, thank you so much for being part of Coral Live again and introducing us to the work of reef restoration.
Always a pleasure, Jamie.
Joel, thank you so much for this stepping in
Yeah, of course.
at the last minute and talking to us a bit about the marine protection that's happening here on Curacao. Thank you very much to all the students watching, all the classes watching. Thank you for your great questions. But for now, that is all we have time for from AXA Coral Live for this year. In fact, this is the last Coral Live lesson. It's a goodbye from Carmarby, goodbye from Curacao, and we hope to see you all next year. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.